Okay, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Well, we have to speak English because our distinguished guest comes from the United States and he's originally from Turkey. That means a non-Spanish speaking country. So anyway, English is the lingua franca of economics. And very slowly, but it is also becoming the lingua franca here at UNAM among ourselves. So I'm sure that you guys are able to follow this conversation. This talk that Professor Firat Demir will present today. So I'm very glad to be here. And I'm very happy to present Professor Firat Demir, who comes from Oklahoma University. And as you may know, Professor Demir did his PhD at the University of Notre Dame under the guidance of our very distinguished professor, Jaime Ross, who unfortunately passed away a few days ago. Originally, Professor Jaime Ross invited Firat to come to UNAM and give a series of talks. And it is really a pity that Jaime cannot be with us today. But of course, we remember him as a leading scholar, as a very important professor of the graduate faculty, who made a great contribution to the conformation of the development economics field. I remember discussing with Jaime years back the idea of organizing the field of development economics in our graduate program. So he made a very important contribution. No question about it. Jaime was a very, very important development economist who put forth a number of ideas and who left behind very important works that we will continue to studying and discussing. And I think Professor Firat Demir is here to deliver a couple of talks which will leave behind, again, a number of problems to be followed up and to discuss and to continue in our research, be as students or as professors. So I want to welcome Professor Firat Demir to the Graduate Faculty of Economics of UNAM. We are very happy that you are with us, and we are really looking forward to your presentations. And the session will be organized as follows. Professor Demir will talk for perhaps about half an hour or 40 minutes or so. The time he decides to use for his presentation. And then we will open the floor for Q&A, questions and answers. And perhaps we will have a couple of rounds of questions and answers. That is up to you. So the floor is yours, Professor Demir.
Thank you, Ignacio, and thanks for having me here. It's my third time in Mexico City. And I'm having mixed feelings this time. I'm here because of our dear friend, Jaime Ross, who invited me here to come. Many of the ideas that are presented in this book and I'll introduce today were inspired by him and his work. I think he was one of the truly living legends of Latin America and the rest of the South or developing countries in terms of economic development and macroeconomics. I think his name will be, together with Paul Brebish and others, for many new generations of economists to read, to learn, and to understand economics of development, problems of development, and what makes the South or developing countries different than the rest. And he was a really true passionate lover of Mexico. I remember our discussions of football matches, and I would say, are you keeping Catalonia or Mexico, Spain, especially in World Cup? And he would say, my parents were Catalan from Spain, but I'm Mexican, and of course I'm supporting Mexico in the soccer games. And he was a beautiful person. But he's with us because the book most of it is inspired by him and his colleague Amitabh Dutt. And I'll introduce some of the works that they introduce in this book as well as we go along. Before then, I would like to thank Ignacio for the introduction, and Benjamin and others, and Hideo for helping bring me here. We managed to make it right on time with the flights, despite the traffic. I was joking just a few minutes ago that it took as much time to come from Oklahoma to Mexico City as much from Mexico City airport to the hotel yesterday. But it happens. So thanks for having me here, and thanks for the beautiful hospitality. Now, a few words about the book. So this is a joint work with my co-author and colleague and also classmate from Notre Dame. He was also a student of Jaime and Amitabh. We have been working on the issues of South-South integration, South-South development for over a decade now. And we used to have a lot more positive view of the South-South integration. Two of us, both being from developing countries or the so-called emerging South, that we thought that the South-South would have more in common to help each other. I studied in Istanbul, and we may debate whether Mexico City has worse traffic than Istanbul or not. I think on the margin, yes, it does. But overall, I don't really feel that much out of home. Oklahoma looks more alien to me than Mexico City in that aspect. But people-wise, friendships, body language. And in Turkey, being Mediterranean, we can't talk without touching each other. And it seems common here too, so I don't have to watch my hands before using any gestures. It's like, Italians, that joke of Nazis captured an Italian communist and they were torturing him, and the communist wasn't telling anything. And then suddenly they realized that the Italian is not confessing anything because his hands were tied behind his back. If you tie his hands, he cannot talk in it, right? You need hands. So before further ado, the book is about the South-South. So if you look at the cover of the book, I think those papers is a rock game, which all of you probably know, maybe different names, right? Is it competition with European Union, Brazil, China? Are they allies or they are rivals? And that will be the topic of the book for the most part. Now, over the course of 10 years or so, we are working on this topic. We realize that it's not all good. It's not all beautiful. It's not all everything that China does or everything that Mexico does or Brazil does to each other or with each other or against each other is not all positive or negative. It depends on if it's a function of many other variables that we try to analyze in the book.
Still working?
Okay. I like this image. This is an HSBC advertisement from a few years ago. It was on major airports in North America when it came out. And it's about South-South trade and South-South integration. You see the terracotta warrior from China, but pay attention to his flip-flops. Brazilian color flip-flops coming together. And they did a similar one. With a time lag maybe. And the same thing with Egypt versus China. You have the dragon on the famous Sphinx in Cairo, right? Is it really reshaping the world economy? When scholars were writing about South-South integration, which is relatively a new topic actually, there was not much, it wasn't mainstream that much, it was on the margins mostly. You had some writings in the 60s and 70s, but it wasn't a big part of the topic of conversation in economics literature or in business. And the main, I think, the theme that I want you to take away at the end of the talk is from the great Tolstoy, from Anna Karenina. All happy families are alike, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. This book is about the unhappy families. It's about the South, about developing countries. So what makes Istanbul different than Mexico City? What makes it different than Shanghai or Cairo or Rio or Buenos Aires? So that's the main topic. And we can have it the questions answer session, why I think all happy families are alike. You may read it as all northern countries are the same, but all south is different. Mostly we say the other way around. We tend to think the north is different or heterogeneous and south is homogeneous. The south is actually the heterogeneous one in this relationship. Now, if you look at the rise of the south as a topic of conversation, there's significant growth in the last 20 years. The UN now has a South-South Cooperation Day, which is the September 12th of each year. Right? Today is almost, right? What's the date today? Today is the 12th. Right? Today is the South-South Day. Globally, United Nations General Assembly declared this as the South Day. And now you have 2013 World Trade Report of the World Trade Organization declaring South-South as the new future for global trade and development. The same with UNIDO, the same with World Bank, the same with UNDP, and even World Bank and Wall Street Journal now took the bandwagon effect of this rise of South-South exchanges as the new future for global economy. Now, what are main objectives in writing this book? Because as I said, we had been working on this topic for many years, and our view of the topic changed over time, evolved over time, became more critical, more pessimist, maybe more balanced, more nuanced than before. So we want to look at a South-South exchanges from a critical development point of view. So from the developmental perspective, what are the gains and losses? What are the main advantages or disadvantages of such exchanges, which you may see as Mexico-China exchanges? And second, we want to take a macro approach. So here we are not following the new development economics, which has become more micro. We are not that much interested about the impact of mosquito nets. Even though they are influential and helpful, we don't think mosquito nets will help sub-Saharan Africa catch up with the North. It won't help slow down the divergence or rate of divergence between the North and South. Because what we have been witnessing already for a while is a divergence between North and South, and more recently a divergence within the South between what we call emerging South and rest of the South. And we take a macro approach. And secondly, we do think that the increasing attention on micro aspects of development is ideologically motivated. It helps disguise the real questions that we need to ask as economists. Why Mexico is not catching up with the US? Why Argentina is falling in the rankings instead of moving and converging to the levels of developed countries? Those are the critical macro questions that developing economists used to ask, but has stopped asking. So we are trying to bring that conversation back to macro. And thirdly, we do think that economic structure matters for long-term development and growth. So structural transformation, which is one of the main signs of economic development, matters. Whether countries are moving up the development ladder from more agricultural, primary good production to industrial and more value-added goods, it does matter. And that answers the puzzle that many economists at IMF have been observing. Why productivity in Latin America has been falling? Well, the answer is obvious, all right? We privatized very unproductive state enterprises in Mexico, but then those jobs and those industries did not move to better industries, more higher value-added industries. Instead, they moved into lower value-added city services. Urban, street corners are full of street sellers in every single developing country. So the average productivity in those industries, of course, are lower than the industries that they were employed before. So average productivity in Latin America has been falling steadily since 1980s, even after correcting for the lost decade of Latin America. The pointer is disagreeing with me. Can we go to the next one? Yeah. So the South-South exchanges in general include a variety of a myriad of exchanges, from trade and finance to labor to technology transfer, migration, remittances, trade and investment agreements, political economy aspect of international organizations in World Bank, IMF, WTO, and so on. We won't be able to do justice to each of those aspects, but we'll focus mostly on a few of them. And those few are the following in terms of questions. We are going to look at in what way and in whose benefit the world trade is changing, especially including those exchanges between South-South. Are all South-South countries equal, or some are more equal than others? As George Orwell asked in The Animal Farm, right? All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. Third, can the southern countries really be a part of the growing global economy? Are they a part of the growing, emerging new world order, as World Bank and others argue, or only a few are in that new world order? And do they really keep the promise of an alternative to the North-South based economic development? Can South-South exchanges replace and fix the problems or the problematic nature of the North-South exchanges? Which countries managed to succeed in this? What are the southern countries that have been successful in the South-South exchanges? How? Why? What did they do different? Can we come up with a list of items that would help countries like Mexico to do, like a kind of house duties, that if they do the following, then they will be more likely to join that emerging world order? What are the common patterns and characteristics and the structure of South-South exchanges? So when Mexico is trading with Argentina or with China, how is that trade structured? Are they even or uneven? Do they feed unevenness, the so-called uneven development of North-South, or is it replicating itself? So Mexico trade with the US, is it very much different than Mexican trade with China or not? And what is the structure of that trade flows? And what do they need to do to minimize those downsides? So I'll come up at the very end with a scoreboard of the things that we need to pay attention to. Now, what makes this book different than others? One, we pay a lot of attention to history in terms of power and ideologies, especially. That's the chapter 2 of the book. I will mostly skip that part, going back to the South-South unaligned movement from the Third World, the creation of the Third World movement in the 50s and 60s. That's in chapter 2. We won't have time to get into that. We can have a discussion if you have any questions. The theory is, I think, important. In the theory, we cover a variety of economic branches, from neoclassical, old, new, to international economics, old, new, and the non-neoclassical branches of economics, from the post-Keynesian structuralist tradition to Marxian traditions, and to what extent they differ or resemble. We won't have, again, too much time to look at the specifics of those different theoretical approaches. But one, I think, general conclusion of the chapter is that there's a general convergence between neoclassical and non-neoclassical fields when it comes to the South-South trade and finance, regarding the nature of South-South trade and finance, what it does not. And finally, the empirics. The book is very rich in empirical analysis. We spend a good amount of time getting into the data, not torturing the data, but making data confess if there's something hidden beneath it. And what are the main findings? Well, one is we don't really find a knight in shining armor. So China is not a knight coming to rescue Mexico, but we really don't find an evil witch of the East or West either. In North American and Western European literature, in economics writings, most of it is focused on bashing China or bashing emerging southern countries. So the newspapers, magazines, and academic papers are full of attacks on the rise of China as a nemesis, as the evil witch of the East, kind of resembling Tolkien's trilogy of the Lord of the Rings, which is very actually one of the most racist books and films, if you read about it. Have you noticed in Lord of the Rings, in the book and the movie versions, all the evil guys are always darker skinned, and they are from the East, and they come to destroy. And the ones on the West are always blonde elves, right? They are handsome, beautiful, they wear nicer dresses, their teeth are much better and whiter and shiner. Orcs are always from the East. So no, we don't find that. We don't think China or the rest of the South is necessarily good or bad, and West is not necessarily good either. And there's significant heterogeneity within the South. The southern countries differ significantly among each other. There's significant differences among them, but still enough similarities to continue to group them as the South. And I'll try to touch some of those points if you have time. Now, this is the overall structure of the book. No, we don't have time, so I won't be going into each of them. Chapter 2, again, is the history. Chapter 3 is the theory. I have some slides in the presentation to look at the theory part if you're interested in terms of what makes neoclassical or other approaches similar, what makes non-neoclassical approaches similar or different. Briefly, if you look at the debate on North-South exchanges, most of the heterodox or non-neoclassical literature is focused on uneven development in North-South dimension. But there's really not much written on South-South. So theory-wise, it's hard to find the foundations of arguments for South-South exchanges. There's some, but not too much. And on the Marxian side, there's not much either. If anything, the Marxian literature is more in favor of North-South exchanges than South-South exchanges, except later followers of Marx, like Rosa Luxemburg or Lenin, differed significantly than the earlier writings. I'll spend some time on chapter 4, definitely on the empirical analysis of South-South exchanges and see what can we see from the data. And chapter 5 is about a second-grade divergence, the rising divergence between parts of the South, which we call emerging South, and rest of the South. Amsden had a book, The Rise of the Rest. There are tons of books about West and the rest, the rise of the West and the fall of the rest, the rise of the rest and fall of the West. You can make lots of, and these are all titles of many different books. And I'll have a few concluding thoughts. So just to briefly, in terms of the content or structure of the North and South dimension that we are analyzing, we classified North as the industrialized, developed countries. So it includes all Western Europe, US and Canada in North America, and in Asia, there's Japan, New Zealand, and Australia. The emerging South includes 55 countries, and we go back half a century in our data analysis, so we don't allow switching between country groups. Not allowing country group switching allows us to see changes in patterns and structures. If you move every country that moves from South to North, and there are not many, there's only one actually in the last half century that moved from the South to North, and that is South Korea, and that is only after the late 1990s that it became a developed country. So we include South Korea in the emerging South. Mexico is also in emerging South. There are 55 countries. Most of the world population lives in those 55 countries because India and China are also there. And then we have rest of South. Number of country-wise, the biggest group is definitely the rest of South. There are 157 countries. And together, rest of South and emerging South is what we call the global South. And it's most countries in the world, most population in the world live in those countries. So those are the unhappy families. They differ a lot with each other. And we'll pay attention to the emerging South and rest of South and how they differ or resemble with each other. So some of the limitations we need to admit, and again in the question answer session we can look at them. We are state-centric, so we are taking each country as a unit of analysis, not each person on the planet as a unit of analysis. And it has significant limitations using that. But there are reasons why we use that way. So it's one caveat. We focus on macro exchanges between countries rather than between peoples. Second one, we ignore multinational corporations. Value the supply chain management and the breaking down of the value that among supply chains are not included. Not because they are not important, they are definitely important, but we can do only this much in a book. Third one is we focus on macro development, which of course ignores gains on micro development. Life expectancy in Mexico increased significantly. The gap between North and South in life expectancy, in infant mortality and so on, is much smaller than the gap in incomes. Texas, north of Mexican border, has pretty much the same level of infant mortality rate as Mexico. So it's almost the same. There's no development gap there. That doesn't mean it's not important. It doesn't mean that we should not pay attention to those gains on human development part, from education to health, but we focus mostly on the macro side in this book. The same with gender aspects and so on. Environment is a big part, is a big missing part of the book. We did not focus on the environment aspect. We focus on it at the very end, very tangentially. And the social movements are excluded. Labor, women, environment, and others are excluded also. Now, brief stylized facts in terms of what we are talking as South-South exchanges. Now, the South-South exchange, if you look at it since 1990s, grew up humongously. As of 2013, when the last data we had at the time of the publication of the book, almost a third of the world trade is South-South trade. And hasn't changed since then. I looked at it just last month for another paper. It's roughly around 30% of world trade right now is South-South trade. Meanwhile, north-south and south-north remain flat. So exchanges from north to south and from south to north, they are not symmetrical, but they remain more or less flat. And if you look at the exports from the south to the rest of the world from 1950 onwards, it increased significantly. It was only 30% of world trade in 1950. In other words, the European countries exported only 30% of world exports in back 1950. Now it's more than half of the world exports. And 58% of all southern exports were between southern countries. So most of southern exports are now to each other. Now, the structure of this trade has changed significantly as well. In 1970, Global South accounted only for 70% of manufacturers' exports. So Global South meaning emerging South plus the rest of South. Only 7% of global manufacturers' goods exports were from southern countries, and even less in high-skilled goods. So if we break down manufactured goods into its components, and in this book we classify them into 5 groups. We have high-skill intensive goods, which are high skill in skill intensity and technological intensity. We follow Lal's definition of skill intensity of goods, and here we have the highest skill and technology intensive goods are called high skill. Now we have medium skill, and we have low skill manufacturers. High skill manufacturers would be iPads, low skill manufacturers would be screwdrivers. Then we have natural resource intensive manufacturers, like manufactured leather, right? Or granite tiles are resource-intensive manufactured goods with very low value added. And then we have primary goods. Primary goods like crude oil or any mining like iron ore, copper ore are primary goods. Or raw tomatoes, kiwis, or avocados from Mexico are primary goods. So those are the classifications. Only 2% of southern exports, or only 2% of global high-skill exports were from developing countries back in 1970. In 2012, 47% of global exports of manufactured goods were from developing countries, and 56% of high-skill exports globally were from developing countries. So in terms of smartphones, tablet, PCs, and all that, 56% of them came from developing countries in 2012. But if you look at South-South, you get similar trends. So in 2012, manufactured goods was 3/4 of all South-South merchandise goods exports. So most of the trade between developing countries, 3/4 of it are manufactured goods. And if you look at high-skill goods, you get the same thing. So share of high-skill goods in South-South trade was only 2% before. Now it's 1/4 of South-South trade. So what Mexico trades with Argentina type exchanges are highly skill-intensive. But 70% of South-South trade is between emerging South countries. So 70% of all trade, of all those goods we mentioned between developing countries are between emerging South countries, between countries like Mexico, Brazil, Turkey, China, India, Argentina, but not the rest. And 85% of South-North trade is also between emerging South and North. So 85% of all trade of South-North is from emerging countries. Rest of South does not factor in that exchange. Now let's look at the good, the bad, the ugly type film, the great Western film, right? So 74% of rest of South exports were primary commodities in 2012. So what rest of South exports, for the most part, 74% of the time is just primary goods, which is the number one among them is crude oil, actually, with no value added. It's just crude oil / other primary goods is what 74% of them export. And in fact, more than half of those countries, and remember there are 154 countries in that group, more than half of them depended on one single commodity for over 1/3 of their earnings. So highly monoculture-based, single product export-led growth model. And this has lots of negative effects for those economies. In terms of high-skill exports, let's focus on those tablet PCs we talked. We said more than half of the high-skill exports globally come from southern countries. But if I separate the South into emerging South and rest of South accounted only 1/3 of 1% of those goods exports. So 0.3% of global exports of high-skilled goods came from rest of South, but 55% came from emerging South. So therefore, when we say South, not all South is the same. This is a graph of the basic trends. If you look at changes over a half century, actually, in terms of the South and North in world merchandise goods exports from 1948 till 2013. Several things stand out. And here I'm not separating emerging South from South. So we are looking at global South and North as two groups in world economy. One thing that stands out is the decline of the North, especially after 1980s. So importance of North-North trade in global goods trade has dropped from over 50% to below 30%. That's one clear trend. Second one is the South-South. The share of South-South trend rate was around 10% for most of the post-1970s, but it climbed over 30% right now. So rise of the South-South comes together with the fall of the North-North in terms of global trade flows. The second one now separates emerging South within South-South. And what you see here is emerging countries or emerging southern countries trade with each other and with the North is the main driver of global South-South and South-North trade. Briefly, the share of emerging South in global South-South trade was over 70%. And there's no trend of significant decline. There's a slight fall after the 2000s, but not that much. And the same is true for this, the importance of emerging South in South-North trade. Most of this trade is driven by emerging South countries. Those 55 countries in emerging South category is what accounts for most of the South-North and South-South action. And we do this one for manufactured goods. So let's look at not total merchandise goods, just focus on manufactured goods. Because going back to Kaldor, we developing economists think that, or give a special place to manufactured goods. Manufactured goods are the place where you will look if you expect any technology transfer, any increase in productivity through externalities, through learning by doing, and so on. And output growth is highly correlated to manufactured goods. So if you look at only manufactured goods, and look at share of South there, rest of South, which is that dashed line at the very bottom, is the share of rest of South in world manufacturers exports. Rest of South does not count in world manufactured goods exports or world manufacturers trade. Right? I'm saying exports, but this is world trade because every exporter has an importer. So this is the total. If you multiply with two, get the global volume of that trade in that direction. So if you look at rest of South, it's near 1%, 2% range, has not gone up, stayed flat. But emerging South has increased steadily from 80s onwards. And that came at the expense of the North. The next one looks at the importance of high-skill goods in total manufacturers. Not just total manufacturers, but I'm interested in high-skill manufactured goods and what is their share in the global high-skill goods exports and which country groups account for most of the action there. You can see the rest of South. So Tolstoy was right. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way, but some are more unhappy than others. Rest of South, 154 countries there, account for nothing. That is the 1/3% share of rest of South in the high-skill trade in the world. And if you look at emerging South, they actually surpassed the northern countries in terms of the size of their high-skill exports, which partly explains the continuing trade war between China and the US, or between Huawei and US IT companies. Right, when I arrived at the airport, right away you see Huawei TVs and advertisements all over the airport. You don't find a single Huawei advertisement in the US. Huawei right now is the second biggest IT company in the world. It comes right after Samsung. In smartphones and tablets, the same. It's the second biggest in the world. In the US, the market share of Huawei is not even in top 10. It's one of the lowest market shares. And the same, more or less, is the same in Western Europe. But in developing countries, Huawei is the leader. And that is part of the story going on here, that increasing importance of emerging South in value-added, high value-added goods, while the share of the North has been declining. Now, the Same is true for global trade agreements. If you look at global trade and investment agreements, what we call PTAs are preferential trade agreements. Like NAFTA is an example of it between Mexico and North, but Mercosur is another one for southern countries, right? And the same with bilateral investment treaties, which countries are signing, where do we see most of the action? And you see the South-South standing out again in that. So since 1950, there were 266 PTAs signed, at least reported to WTO, and 88% of them were after 1988. And 75% of the trade through PTAs were between countries of the South. And the same thing is true for BITs. Most of the BITs signed throughout the 2000s, which is most of the BITs signed since 1950s, are between developing countries. So increasingly countries like Mexico and Argentina are getting into these trade agreements and investment deals with each other. Are they different then? Like, is a trade agreement between Mexico and Argentina any different than between Mexico and US? There are reasons to think yes, there are significant differences qualitatively and quantitatively. And if you have time, we'll look at some of those issues maybe at the Q&A session. Just to put it in terms of visuals, you can see the jump in preferential trade agreements, and especially the jump between South-South pairs after 1950s. And you get the same thing for global preferential goods trade. So here we are looking at the global preferential trade agreements, like NAFTA-type trade agreements between countries, and then we are looking at what % of the trade between those countries were through those trade agreements. Most of the world trade right now are through those trade agreements. They're increasingly playing a major role, which is the debate right now Brexit is causing in case of the UK. Will they be part of the customs union with European Union? Will they exit the European Union without a trade agreement? That's the type of trade agreements we are looking at here. Let's see if I can jump this one here. So I'm going to skip the theory part. Again, as I said, if you're interested on the questions part, we'll look at some of them. But I want to look at the meat of the data part of it. So this is the share of high skill exports in total exports in each direction of trade over decades. So we divide them on each 10-year periods to see how it evolved over time. And I'm looking at each direction of trade. So what it means is, like, if you are looking at the first column, South-South, and that says 2% for 1960 to 1969. What that number refers to is 2% of South-South trade during that period was high-skilled good exports. So 2% of total South-South trade throughout 60s was high-skill. And South emerging, it was 2%, South-North was 0. That means almost 0% of total exports of southern countries to the northern countries as a share of total southern exports to the northern countries was high skill. So they were not exporting any high skill goods. But there was more action between each other. And it was the cause of a significant literature in the 70s and 80s by Alice Amsden and others arguing that South-South trade has the potential of uplifting countries in the South. Now, one argument for that was, do they sell Russian cars in Mexico? Do you have any Russian cars? No? So Russian cars are very popular in Asia, Middle East, East and North Asia also, and Eastern Europe. You can find those Russian cars anywhere in Turkey. They are like a tank. You can go drive through Gulf of Mexico to the US side underwater. Nothing will happen. But the luxuries is not the best part of those cars. Like, it's not going to hit your seat. It's not going to have automatic windows, right? It won't have eyesight technology or cameras. But they work pretty good in terms of engine. The same is true for Indian cars. Any Indian cars here? No. Like Tata is very popular in Turkey. Same with the Iranian cars. Now, those cars are not available in northern markets because they lag in terms of certain luxury aspects of driving. Right? You don't get in the car and then start showing off around with those cars. It's not that. That's not what you do for them. But they work very good and they are cheap. So if Iran or India or Russia can produce these cars and export to other developing countries, as the numbers data showed, in fact, most of the exports of Iran or Russia of these cars go to other developing countries, then they can improve their productive capacity. Those cars will improve over time. I don't know if any of you have seen, many of you are younger than me, but I remember the old Hyundais. Old Hyundais were terrible cars. They would break down. They were not very good. The same with Toyota. Toyota was not a luxury car. It wasn't a good car at all. Same with Honda. Most of Japanese cars were low-end cars, pretty much like Iranian or Indian cars today. But over time, they allowed them to improve their productivity. By doing, they learned better. By copying, imitating other better technologies, they managed to uplift their productive capacity. So South Korean cars today are very good in terms of consumer report rankings in the US. In fact, in many car range brands, Hyundai's surpassed Toyota. They are at par with Honda, and Subaru the same. So there was more potential from South-South exchanges. And if you look at over the decades, South-South, the importance of high-skilled goods in South-South exchanges increased. Huawei brand cell phones is a good example. You have Huawei phones here. How many of you have a Huawei phone here? Do you have? One only? 2, 3, 4, maybe 5. In the US, nobody has. I don't know anybody who has a Huawei. But you are buying a Huawei phone, and Huawei is producing very good cell phones and tablets and other IT products. So that is the potential that this table refers to. And if you look at emerging South, you see the same potential over years. And here you have two groups in this table. One is high-skill goods, like cell phones. The second is medium-skill goods, like chemicals, for example, are medium-skill products. For both range of products, the importance of them within each direction of South-South was higher than South-North. So if you look at medium-skill goods, 24% of South-South trade in 2009-2012 period, very last period that we had in the book, a quarter of them was medium-skill. And you don't see that in South-North. So developing countries have a hard time exporting those high and medium-skill goods to the northern markets. Now, there are several reasons for that. We can discuss that later on. One obvious explanation is quality difference. But there are some recent papers and interesting dissertations coming out of it. In fact, the quality difference right now is not that big different. Like a Chinese-made truck is not that much inferior to an American-made truck. Volvo is not necessarily, or Audi is not necessarily better than a Chinese car. Your Huawei phone is not inferior to Apple products. But there's a perceived quality inferiority still continues, and it affects the prices of those products. So those products sell at a lower price, and it inhibits the growth of high-skilled products in southern countries. So South-South may offer an escape to that, given that high-skill and medium-skill goods occupy a bigger share of South-South exchanges than South-North exchanges. And you can see that in the South-North, in the late even 2000s period, the exports of high-skilled goods from rest of South to the North was only 1%. But South-South was 7 times higher, 7%. And the same thing you see for emerging exchanges like China, Mexico exchanges compared to emerging North exchanges. Now, if you look at, instead of within each direction, if you look at the totals, so you are looking at total exports of South-South goods of high skill within South-South, you again find significant differences. Most of the high skill goods and medium skill goods from South, both the rest of the South and emerging South, are to each other than to the developed country markets. So most of the high-end products China exports goes to other developing countries. The same is true for rest of South, countries like Uganda in sub-Saharan Africa, or Mozambique or Kenya. And this has significant implications for future of trade in those countries. So this is a very raw, unconditional correlation between two things. One is you have on the y-axis the GDP per capita in natural logs, and each data point is 1 year, one country, over the period of, I think, 25 years. And the x-axis, your share of primary goods in total exports. So I'm looking at the importance of primary goods, like crude oil, in total exports of a country at a given time period. And I'm looking at unconditional correlation of that with the income of that country. And you can see a slight negative slope there. As you export more and more primary goods, your incomes actually go down. That is the so-called natural resource curse. Countries that export more natural resources are poorer countries. There are only 2 countries that escaped the natural resource curse. One is Norway, the other one is US. You really don't have any other pretty much developed country that is rich in natural resources. Now, I do the same thing with high-skill goods. So this time your x-axis is the share of high-skill goods in total exports. So what percent of your exports are high-skill goods? And then you look at your income per person, and it's highly positively correlated. If you export high-skill goods like Huawei cell phones or Chinese cars, yes, you get more higher income. It's highly correlated, and there's significant work in the last 10 years from neoclassical and non-neoclassical strains of the literature that shows that what you export matters. The trade literature throughout the 60s and 70s argued that what you export doesn't matter. The Ricardian static trade theory argued 2 countries engaged in trade should specialize in what they are good in producing at that very moment. So it's static Ricardian model, but dynamic theories of trade shows that what you export matters for long-run growth and development. In other words, whether you export potato chips or computer chips, they will have different implications for your long-run growth. And I'm showing you here the median export values of each product category in each country group category. What you have is 5 groups of products a country exports: high-skill goods, medium-skill goods, low-skill goods, resource-intensive manufactured goods, and primary goods. You can see the difference in prices and value added, independent of which group of country you are, whether rest of the South, North, or emerging South. Countries that export high-skill goods earn a lot more per unit of exports. You earn a lot more from selling a computer chip than a potato chip. And on South-South finance, there's significant work also that we put in the book, and outside there's a growing literature. There are serious arguments in favor of South-South exchanges in finance. From the comparative advantage of South in South, like Southern countries have a comparative advantage. There seems to be a trend on that part. I have a few papers myself showing why Southern exporters or Southern investors are better off and are actually more advantageous in investing in other developing countries. There's more potential for technology transferring know-how. Maybe there's more potential for job creations, that unlike northern technologies, southern technologies are more labor intensive. Therefore, the technology transfer that takes place from south to south will create more jobs in the south who are labor intensive, and their endowments are skewed in favor of labor. Their adaptive and adaptive capacities are more similar. So there's this literature arguing that yes, northern countries may have the first or frontier age technology, but adapting those technologies and modifying them and using and modifying for local needs is more costly. The tacit knowledge required for that is higher. Plus, it's much more costly to fix, repair those products than the products you import from other developing countries, which might be inferior, but might be easier to maintain, to adapt, to modify. And there's also the power part, which don't know if we'll have time in terms of the international disputes. This is WTO disputes by income group. So WTO disputes refer to countries bringing a charge against another country, like Mexico suing the United States for, let's say, corn subsidies in WTO. If you look at the distribution of it in terms of complainants, countries that are pressing charges, and respondents, countries that are receiving charges. Most of the action is between high-income countries and upper-middle-income countries. Rest of South, which is mostly in low income, there's not much going on. They don't really press charges or not accuse much either. But there's an ongoing battle between emerging South and North and between the North. The biggest number of court cases in the US in IT industries is between Samsung and Apple. And if you look at countries in terms of which countries are pressing most charges, US comes as number one, and as a respondent also comes number one. Over a quarter of responses or accusations came to US, and in terms of accusations that countries press, 1/5 came from US alone, followed by European Union, Canada, Brazil, Mexico, India. And you can look at those countries in terms of emerging South. They're emerging South countries. You won't find any rest of South countries on either column, either as a complainant or as a respondent. And these 10 countries account for over 3/4 of total WTO disputes. It's another bifurcation between South, within rest of South, and emerging South. In terms of country pairs, which country pairs are most receiving responses or complaining? US and China is, and these are in terms of the numbers, the biggest North-South comes from US and China, and for European Union, EU and India is their biggest pairs, and for Canada, it's Canada and China. From southern countries, Mexico is right there in the second group, right? Mexico charges the most US with 9 out of total 11 charges against the North. And then comes India from the emerging South. And this is the same with investor-state disputes, when countries are accused by investors against each other, rather than country to country. Here you have an investor, like when Argentina defaulted on its debt after 2001 crisis, an investor could sue government of Argentina, right? So these are the investor-state disputes, which are allowed if a country or country pairs signed a certain type of investment agreement with each other. And what you find here is that most of the actions, again, North, and North emerging South. The numbers in parentheses are these investor-state disputes in the opposite direction, like instead of North, rest of South, is rest of South pressing charges against the North. Now, what I want you to focus on here, if you look at the number of charges from North to the rest of South throughout different decades, and the number from rest of South to the North, rest of South really doesn't even have any charges against the North. Government of Uganda does not have neither the ability nor the capacity to press charges against the US, even if they have grounds to be able to press charges against the US. But the number of charges from North to rest of South is increasing. This is important for development policy space, because this limits what developing countries can and cannot do. If you look at North emerging South, you see a similar trend. Northern countries brought, like in 2010-2015 period, there were 120 charges against emerging South countries, but only 6 charges from emerging South against the North. And that is a very big power imbalance between North and emerging South that continues to persist. And the number of charges, such accusations from investors to governments, is very small within the South group pairs. So yeah, emerging South also has charges against emerging South, but the numbers are very different. The total number between 2010 and 2015 between emerging South pairs was only 20, as opposed to 120 from North to emerging South. That is 6 times less. That is important in terms of what they can or they cannot do and what future you would expect from emerging South. All right, now let's look at the respondents and claimants in this investor-state disputes. Number one country in the South that was accused by investors was Argentina. Most of it is from the default of Argentinian governments on its external debt. Number 2 comes Venezuela. Number 3, Czech Republic. 4, Egypt. 5, Canada. 6, Ecuador. 7, Mexico. 8, India. 9, Ukraine. And 10, Poland. And if you look at those top 10 countries, except Canada, all the rest are in emerging South category. And in terms of claimants, US comes by far the biggest. And most of the accusations, investors come from the North. So Northern investors charge Southern countries with those violations of their rights. And it's a very uneven relationship between the two. That limits development space in terms of policy making in the countries of the South. So if Mexican government wants to do certain things that violates a certain trade or investment agreement Mexican government signed, then the developed country investors have the right to sue Mexican government. And those accusations don't go through the domestic judicial system. Those go through the international arbitration, rather than within the domestic Mexican judicial system. That affects the outcomes also. Gonna skip the discussion on intra-regional trade, but most of the South-South trade is intra-regional. So Latin America mostly trades with Latin America, East Asia trades mostly with East Asia. Sub-Saharan Africa trades mostly with Sub-Saharan Africa, which has pluses and minuses in terms of what it can and cannot do. I want to take one thing here in terms of the export values, in terms of the development space, in terms of what you produce matters for growth. So look at East Asia and Pacific. That is the first column. South Korea is there. China is there. Right? Look at the high skill goods. And you have two variables there, V and Q. V is the value. Q is the quantity of your total exports. So what that column is telling you, that in East Asia and Pacific, 25% of the value of their exports came from high skill goods. So a quarter of total export earnings in Southeast Asia and Pacific came from the exports of high skill goods, which accounted for only 1% of their export volumes. So 1% of their exports, in terms of the totals they're exporting, generated a quarter of their export earnings. They are the ones that are the most value-added and value-added generating industries and goods, and that's what we need to be focusing on. And it is true for any region you want. Most of the export earnings comes from high-skill earnings. If you look at the lower in that scale, from low primary goods, they don't really generate much export earnings in terms of quantity. Like if you look at East Asia with primary goods, 8% of the value came from 40%. Another thing I want you to remember from this table is, independent on which region you are, they still export primary goods or low value-added goods. US is the biggest exporter of corn in the planet. We forget that. European Union is the second biggest exporter of sugar, right after Brazil. Even though the cost of sugar production in European Union is 7 times higher than cost of sugar production in Brazil. Right? So countries continue to export and produce primary goods, even after they became developed. But most of the revenues come from higher-end products. Skip that. This is market diversification, telling you how diversified market structure of exports of these countries. And you find a standard pattern that Prebisch and Singer and others from Latin American perspective emphasized in the 50s and 60s. Most of the rest of South countries export very few products to very few markets. Here's a question for you. 98% of manufactured good exports from Mexico goes to which country? United States. 98% of manufactured goods exports, 98 goes to one country. Now, if US puts any trade barriers or threatens to put any trade barriers or implies to put any trade barriers on Mexican manufacturers, you can imagine the implications. And the trend for emerging South and North is very different than the rest of South. And the same thing for intra-regional trade, which is important for development policy. That intra-regional trade is the highest in North-North, followed by emerging South. In terms of climbing up the value-added ladder or manufacturer skill intensity, intra-industry trade is very important. Unlike the Ricardian model, most of trade between northern countries are in intra-industry, not between North and South, but within the North. Exchange of similar goods, exchange of cars, like Germans sell lots of cars to Americans and vice versa. And it is very low in rest of South. It's almost 7 to 10 times lower in rest of South than it's in the North. What do Southern countries export? This is total global exports of rest of South countries. Close to 70% of rest of South countries' exports are primary goods of one type, oil. Either crude oil, which is over half of the exports, or processed oil, like refined oil, rather than crude oil. If you add them up, they will come to 70% of their exports. These are the 10 largest items they export. So one conclusion of the book, when we refer to rest of South countries and we talk about developing countries, right? There are many ways, words we use to define the South. Center, periphery, north, south, satellite, metropolis, periphery, semi-periphery. But we usually call them as developing countries. The truth of the matter is that most of the countries that we call South, which are in the rest of South, are not developing. They are stuck. They are not developing. They are not going anywhere in terms of the development ladder. They are producing mostly primary goods. For emerging South, it is different. For emerging South, even though top 10 are still has primary goods, if you get out of 10 items, there are more than 5 items that are high-skill goods. And the concentration of each of exported goods are much lower. For emerging South, petroleum oils is number one, but it's only 7% of their exports. And then they have many other goods that are classified as high-skill intensive goods. That opens the door for development for emerging South, but not for rest of South. Skip those. All right, good. That one will work maybe better. Oh, this works great. Okay, save the day. Because we'll come to the fun part where I have some slides for Mexico too. So what do we mean by the second great divergence? The first great divergence was the divergence between the North and the South. There's this famous paper from the 90s, Divergence Big Time. Because the most of the econ models we teach in undergrad promises convergence. US and Mexico is supposed to converge to each other. In 1960, do you know the income gap between South Korea and Mexico? If I compared an average Korean and average Mexican in 1960, how was the gap? Was it similar, do you think?
Yeah, almost similar. 1960s, you mean?
In 1960, an average Mexican was 4 times richer than an average Korean.
Right.
1960, Mexico was 4 times richer per person than Korea, and almost as much than Taiwan. Today, South Korea is a developed country, and Mexico stayed where it was in 1960. So that's the divergence between North and South. And within the South, we see a similar divergence. So let's look at country groups, briefly summarizing. In terms of world trade, emerging South, rest of South, and then I have China as a separate category, which deserves to be a separate category. In terms of primary goods, 43% of global trade in primary goods come from southern countries, from the emerging South, 22% from rest of South. Let's focus on high-skill goods. 55% of high-skill goods trade in the world comes from emerging South, but only 0.4% comes from rest of South. And China accounts 25% of high-skill goods. In fact, China exports over 60 times more high-skill goods than 154 countries in rest of South combined. Repeating, one country, China, exports more high-skill goods than 154 countries combined, and it is more than 60 times folds, or 60 folds more. So that is the two country groups, rest of South and emerging South, and we see that in global organizations as well. Another thing that we see within emerging South is a bifurcation too. So we include countries like Argentina, Chile, Mexico in emerging South. But if we wrote this book maybe 20 years, or maybe less than 20 years, 10 years from today, if any of you decided to pick up any of these topics and wrote your dissertations 10 years from today, it might be possible you will put Mexico and Chile and Argentina in the rest of the South, not in emerging South. And I'll explain why. Because most of countries like in the emerging South that were emerging, that were developing, are undeveloping, deindustrializing, reprimarization of development, what we call. Reprimarization means countries that were moving in the industrial level, producing manufacturers, are deindustrializing. They are stopping production of manufacturers, going back to either primary goods production or low-skill, low-valued services. Street sellers, street vendors type, very low-valued services. And you see that in Latin America particularly. And that's what Jaime Ross and many others emphasized. It's the cursed growth of Latin America throughout 2000s. It's a cursed growth because the growth was propelled with the export of primary goods, copper for Chile, oil for Mexico, soybeans for Argentina and Brazil. And this is a cursed growth. This is the deindustrialization and reprimarization of development in Latin America particularly. So this is the share of natural resource and primary goods and natural resource intensive manufacturers in rest of South. As you can see, it's already close to 80%. In 2013, 24 countries relied on China for more than a quarter of their export earnings. In some, it was higher. Iran, 34%. Mongolia, 91%. 91% of total exports of Mongolia went to China. Similar to Mexico, 98% of manufacturers' exports of Mexico goes to one country, US. This is for the case of China. And if you look at the importance of Chinese exports and imports in world trade, there's a significant structural transformation. It's amazing change. Within 20 years, makes the Chinese economy change from being a primary good exporting or low-skilled manufactured good exporting country to a high-skilled good exporting country. Remember, even when I was in college, made in China meant cheap and low quality. We would get watches, which we knew it will break after 3 months, but it was still cheaper, even after you replaced it 3 months, than getting a Swiss watch. It changed. In 1990, and this is total importance of world trade of China, only in terms of high-skilled goods, 3% of world exports of high-skilled goods came from Mexico, from China in 1990. In 2012, it was 28%. In 1990, only 3% of high-skilled goods were produced in China globally. That is now a third of total world production of high-skilled goods. And their imports changed. They increasingly import low-skill and primary goods from the rest and export high-skill goods in return. And you see this if you break it down in terms of the direction, which I will come quickly. Actually, let's get these individual commodities. So share of Chinese appetite for certain commodities. Take copper. In 1990, less than 3% of world copper imports were by China. 2012, 28%. Take any commodity you want. Iron, only 3.8% was imported by China. 62% at the end of 2012. And this affected different countries significantly in terms of the structure of their trade. I'll skip the numbers so that you have some time for questions. But China, from being an importer of high-skilled goods, an exporter of primary goods, became an exporter of high-skilled goods, an importer of primary goods. And this affected Latin America significantly. So I have the Latin American trade here. And what you find is, like in 1990, exports to Latin America of primary goods was 10% of Chinese exports. In 2012, it was only 2%. Imports from Latin America of primary goods was 31% of their trade. It became 45%. High-skilled goods, China exported only 7% of its exports in high-skilled goods to Latin America back in 1990, which is not that old. Remember 1990s. Okay, the pop music was not the best, but you know, and by 2012, it is 35% of their exports. So China exports high-skilled goods to Mexico now and importing primary goods from Mexico. Take Chile. Chile is a very stark example of what happened in Latin America throughout the 2000s. Share of copper in total Chilean exports was 41% in 1990. In 2012, it's 55%. Share of copper exports in total Chilean exports to China was 21%. Now it's 78%. So 78% of exports from Chile to China is just one product, copper. And the importance of China in Chilean copper exports was near zero before. Now it is 37%. Now look at the copper prices. Do you see this fluctuation? It's the typical commodity boom-bust cycle. Where the economy grows, commodity prices go up. Where the economy slows down, commodity prices go down. This is the rise and fall of your incomes. And it's the Chilean economic structure, very similar to other Latin American countries, except a few. This is oil, coffee, and soybean and cocoa prices. Again, affects Latin American countries tremendously. See these fluctuations. If you look at the price of tablet PCs, iPhones, you don't see this fluctuation. If anything, it goes up or it stays stable, but it doesn't fluctuate as much. If more than half of your exports are one product, copper, and copper prices fluctuate this much, that doesn't leave much room for development policy space. And you get the nickel, tin, and ore prices the same. I'm gonna look at individual countries. You have several emerging markets here. You have Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and now let's look at Mexico, South Korea, and Turkey. You see very different animals here. If I look at these 5 emerging markets, emerging South countries, only one managed to avoid this cursed growth, and it is South Korea. South Korea exports high-skilled goods more and more to China and doesn't export much primary goods to China. But for all the rest, the structure of trade changed significantly. Look at Mexico there. In 1990, Chinese exports to Mexico, 15% of them were primary goods. 2012, it's only 3%. So Mexico is not exporting primary goods to China is not exporting primary goods. In terms of low-skill goods, 45% of Chinese exports to Mexico were low-skill goods, like watches, screwdrivers, hammers, those type of manufactured goods. 45%. That number dropped from 45 to 16% in 2012. If you look at high skill, it increased from 10 to 51%. So China is exporting 5-fold more high-skill goods and as much less low-skill goods. Now let's see what China imports from Mexico. The imports of high-skill goods doubled from around 10% to 20%. That's good news. But meanwhile, it more than doubled for other lower-end goods. So for primary, it increased from 5 to 13. For low-skill, for natural resource-intensive goods, from 9 to 30, so 3-folds increase in lower-end goods. And high-skill goods increase only marginally compared to how much the import changed. So you'll have a big trade imbalance between China and Mexico trade in favor of China in terms of value added at the expense of Mexico. And there are many reasons why it happened, how it happened. We think it has a lot to do with industrial policy. There's lots of questions that I won't have time to look at, from land grabbing, land acquisitions of southern countries and northern countries in each other, to FDI. With climate change, land will become the next gold rush. So many major developing countries like China and developed countries are grabbing lands like a gold rush around the world. And it is something that is very unspoken. You don't really see that in economics literature much. But that will, with climate change, this will be very important, because you are leasing or buying those lands in other countries for producing crops that you no longer will be able to produce. So they are for food security. That is what will come in the next 10, 15 years, and they are planning it already ahead of the time. And the countries there are very obvious in terms of who is doing what. I'll skip those land deals. The same with the changes in the IMF and World Bank. The rise of the South is coming at whose expense? The rise of China offers a development policy space for countries like Mexico, because there's an alternative of borrowing. China lends more to Latin America. China alone lends more to Latin America than US, European Union, IMF, and World Bank combined. China is the biggest lender in Latin America and Africa for the last 10 years in terms of both aid flows, loans, credit, direct investments, but even concessional loans and so on. China is the biggest investor. The BRICS Bank, or the South Bank, that China initiated together with Brazil, is a major lender of infrastructure projects in many developing countries. And it opened up more policy space in places like World Bank, a rival perhaps. But also there's some negatives regarding behavior of World Bank. Now, what we come as an end in terms of the South-South exchanges, whether the rise of China comes at the expense of Mexico or not, depends on a list of kind of like laundry list. At the beginning, I said this is not inherently good or bad. The increasing importance of China in world economy and in southern economies especially may be good or bad. It depends on a variety of factors: on trade, on technology transfer, in investment and capital flows. We have two columns: whether the rise of certain southern countries are complementary or competitive. So when China starts exporting more to the US, does it come at the expense of Mexican exports or not, in terms of both market access and in terms of the cost of production? Or are they complementary? So if China produces certain inputs of capital goods, does it allow Mexico to import them from China to lower cost and with more technological know-how and technology transfer? The same with investment flows. What kind of investments are coming from China to Mexico? Under what conditions are they coming? What about institutional development? Is Mexico better off if they engage and align more with the US and European Union, or with China in terms of the capacity building in its institutions, like rule of law, right, democracy, and so on? And there's a big open literature there. What about trade agreements?
Is Mexico better off with the NAFTA, or it's not NAFTA anymore, but I still call it NAFTA because the new one has not as easy acronym. Is it better? Is it benefiting Mexico more than a trade agreement Mexico has with Central American or Southern Cone countries in Latin America? It again depends. The capacity for negotiating better deals is better in South-South. Argentina is not significantly different than Mexico in terms of ability to bargain, ability to leverage, ability to reciprocate or threaten. But this is different, perhaps, that affects. The same with labor rights. Is Mexico better off in terms of labor rights in Mexico with its exchanges with the US or with China? China doesn't have any labor rights. There's some, still more than China in the case of the US. European Union has a lot more. So in terms of capacity building for labor unions and labor rights, which one is more beneficial for workers in Mexico? Same with environment, in terms of environmental protection. Despite all the negatives, if you look at a typical investment that goes from World Bank or from US or European Union to a developing country, they have to fulfill many obligations, including environmental footprint. Environmental impact analysis is a requirement by any World Bank loan. There's no such thing from China. China does not require any environmental impact assessment when they invest in Mexico. This has both pluses and minuses. It's plus because there are less strings attached. So for a country that doesn't have the capacity to protect its nature, maybe it's a positive thing. But if you are referring to a country like Brazil, with the Amazon forest being burnt to the ground, then maybe investments of China there is not a big plus. It's a negative for us all. And the same with the global governance, in terms of global governance of organizations from World Bank to the rest, from United Nations, maybe it's a plus or minus. So in terms of final thoughts, do observe a divergence within the emerging South too, and rest of South is stuck at a low level of development with no promise of changes in any time soon. I don't see rest of the South developing anytime soon. With climate change, probably it will be even worse because rest of the South has neither the capacity to deal with it, but they will be exposed to the risks the most. The industrialization is happening within the emerging South as well. Rise of China seems to be coming at the expense of emerging South, which means emerging South may move further to the South. In terms of human rights and labor rights, we do see some negative developments from South-South, but not conclusive. And there are questions about whether or not the South, emerging South can replace the North as the engine of growth for Southern development. And the cooperation versus competition remains to be seen. Now, China, interestingly, emphasizes all these things in many of its meetings, from environment to the South-South solidarity. They are very proud that they were not an imperial power in Latin America and Africa, but they usually turn a blind eye to existing colonial relationships China has from other southern countries in Asia. But there's some growing attention or awareness of the limits to South-South exchanges. So I will stop here. There's a lot we cannot finish. I'm already over time that I was given. I'd like to leave the rest to any questions, comments, objections you have.
Thank you, Firat, for such an interesting presentation of your book. I mean, it's full of very important insights, and I'm sure from the floor we can get some questions which will entice you to further, elaborate on the arguments that you have just presented. So the floor is open for your questions. So who wants to start raising questions? Please feel free to raise your question either in English or Spanish. If you want to raise your question in Spanish, we can translate it anyway. So yes, please. Can you please identify yourself and then make your question?
Okay, hi, my name is Victor, and I'm from I study in the economics faculty. So first of all, thank you to be here, Professor Firat, or Firat. I don't know if I say your name correctly. But before to ask you my question, I'd like to say something. As you know, Professor, Mexico, our country, has 12 commercial trades with 46 countries, but to be honest, the only one significant is that we have with United States. I mean NAFTA. Most of our exports go to United States, as you say. Although our exports have grown 100% since 1970 to 2016, sorry, and that growth is because, in part of NAFTA, our country hasn't grown in a significant way in these years. So my question is, do you think that Mexico has any chance to diversify its trade with the South or with another country if we have the pressure of America? Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. Any more question? Any further question?
Thanks. Well, first of all, thanks for the very eloquent and enlightening talk. I have two questions. One is, so what appears as high-skilled exports is also part of global value chains, right? So doesn't that kind of distort the picture? So it doesn't necessarily mean that the value added, so you can, that the value means as much value added, right? The iPhone, and what about the service sector, right? The iPhone developed in the US but produced and assembled in China, so doesn't that somehow distort the picture of the importance of high-skilled exports? And the second question, so what do you think are the implications of these new South-South trade relations for developmentalist policies today in a structuralist tradition? Right, because the idea of South-South trade, like in the traditional structuralist perspective, was escaping asymmetry in global trade and expanding markets with countries that are more equal. So, and today, it's like, as you say, like, you also have like reprimarization. So it doesn't mean that, like from a Latin American perspective, does it matter like if you export primary goods to China instead of other northern countries? So and how does that relate to like these old ideas of structuralist thinking and development policy or industrial policies today?
Yeah, is there any more questions? Yes. Over there.
Thank you for the interesting presentation. I'm Saul Basurto from this department. I'm associate professor. One question, well, the first comment I have is, I'm surprised that the environment is not part of the book, but I can imagine why. It requires a lot of work. You have done a lot of work on this book, and it's very interesting. The question is, do you have any plans to incorporate the environment on this kind of analysis? Because I was wondering whether there are some environmental policies in Europe that perhaps have forced some countries to move dirty production to the south or to the emerging countries. So that's why perhaps we observe those trends in the graphs that you presented, showing us the upward trend in the share of exports from emerging countries to emerging countries and to the north. So those are my questions. Like,
Okay. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, Benjamin, please. Wait for the mic, please.
Personally, I'll be very grateful having a word about the Islamic finance, South America. I have in mind a paper written by Ayet Singh, who also passed away by this moment. Ayet Singh.
Ajit Singh, yeah. Ajit Singh, yes.
Ajit Singh, a macroeconomist of development, Cambridgian one, because he was saying, you know, because religious belief or principles, they manage to hide, you know, the finance flows in Brazil, Argentina, and so on. Did you research, did some research about, the Islamic finance? And second one, and I think this is the problem of the books, many data you are showing finish just 2013, this century. But this year coincide with the fall down of the super cycle prices, raw materials all over the world. How the data change so far? I mean, from that year to the last one you have information.
Okay. Well, I will take advantage of having the mic in front of me to raise a couple of questions for you. And the first is somehow related to what Christian and Saul pointed out. I mean, it's true. I mean, there is this group of emerging South, which is representing sort of a challenge to the North. But I wonder to what extent, in your analysis, you know, multinational corporations are behind this, you know, sort of a boom of emerging South. Perhaps, of course, I mean, the role of multinational corporations will be different country-wise, but at least for the case of Mexico, I mean, it's absolutely important, the role of multinational corporations behind the export boom of the Mexican economy. And I'm sure this must be different for the case of China and some other emerging countries. And the second question has to do with the comparison that you just mentioned between Mexico and South Korea. Yes, Mexico was doing much better, not only better, but much better than South Korea back in the second post-World War period. And, but something happened, you know, at the beginning of the 1980s, Mexico began doing much, worse than South Korea. So the question arises as to what South Korea did differently vis-a-vis Mexico, and what not only South Korea but some other emerging countries did differently, because it's sort of a, you know, it's very strange, because Mexico and Brazil were describing a much stronger path of economic development than some other so-called emerging countries that are, you know, doing better nowadays. Something must have happened all of a sudden at the beginning of the 1980s.
Can I answer it?
Yes.
These are all excellent questions. I'll go into order and group some of them that they were overlapping, at least in my mind. One is the excellent question of the trade growth versus, or trade or export-led growth is a different thing than export growth. After 80s, and it comes to your last question, what happened to Mexico is very, very standard in many, unfortunately, developing countries with some sort of ISI and industrialization experience. In the 80s, they moved to export growth model, which was not export-led growth model. So Mexico exports a lot, but the value inside those exports, how much added within Mexico, is very small. It's part of it, the supply chain management. And you can catch that in the data, despite the intra-firm pricing and trading problems, that if you look at how much of it is imported from China, brought to Mexico in assembly line maquiladoras, put together and exported to the US. That is the Mexican way after 1980s. It became an export platform with no technological transfer, with no know-how transfer, with no value-added or domestic component requirements imposed on those exporters. So it's a poster child of export growth, but not export-led growth. And those two things are very, very different.
Now, how much room that creates for diversification away from the US? With the current pattern, I don't see much. With the current pattern of increasing embeddedness of Mexican economy into the US economy, creates a typical north-south dependent growth model, where if US economy grows, Mexican exports do good. If US economy slows down, Mexican economy slows down. And in terms of the transfer of technology to Mexican producers, there's not much. And in the agricultural sector, you see it a lot. In my classes, I give always the example of corn. Before NAFTA, a third of corn was imported for Mexico. Now over half, close to 70% of Mexican corn consumption is coming from the US, from imported there. And this is a country that invented the corn, right? And what happens with that excess supply of labor? That excess supply of labor cannot go into industry because it's not growing. It's not absorbing that excess surplus of labor from the countryside. So you have typical Lewis type, unlimited labor supply in countryside, who are losing their jobs because even subsistence sector is not absorbing them. Why? Because the agricultural prices cannot compete with the prices from the US. So they cross the border. It causes the illegal immigration and all this humanitarian disaster happening, not just in Mexico, throughout Latin America. So I think that's one big difference between South countries like South Korea, China, and Mexico. China right now requires domestic input component thresholds. So if Boeing goes into Chinese market to produce, Chinese government tells within X number of years, you have to increase your domestic input components used in the production of whatever you are doing up to XYZ. Mexico doesn't have any such requirement. Therefore, all the parts come from abroad, from wherever cheapest they can find, and they put them together here. That limits how much technology transfer can take place. And that's one of the biggest issues between US government and China. Because China tells American companies, if you want to do business here, you have to transfer technology. How do you transfer technology? They force them to form partnerships. In many industries, foreigners cannot own more than 49%. In many industries, you have to form partnerships with local producers. That makes sure that local Chinese producers learn how to do those things. Domestic input requirements also increase the know-how and capacity domestically, which lowers how much you import from abroad. Even with supply chains, the Chinese case is very different than the Mexican case. Now, in terms of the second question, which relates to the first one also, the supply chain, in the beginning, that was one of the disclaimers. We did not look at intra-firm and whether your location in the supply chain management, what cut of that value slice you are taking. But with the aggregate trade data, still you can take a look at the value added, how much is domestically generated. So export and imports are provided together in most of the data to show if you're exporting this much high skill, how much imports of high skill is coming from there. And you can do basic even regression and correlation analysis to see your imported input dependence of your exports. So Turkey is another country very similar to Mexico in terms of divergence. Turkey and Mexico were roughly similar in 1960. They are still roughly similar today. They have not changed much. The Turkish high-skill manufactured exports correlation with high-skill imports is 0.75. So that means a serious balance of payments problem because your exports are highly dependent on imports of those goods. And the only time you generate the trade surplus is when your economy crashes. So consumption goes down, then you don't import much. Other times, you always run a trade deficit. But it's a very interesting topic to look at how much. And we discussed some of it in terms of potential for knowledge transfer and climbing up the value chain. Because even if you are a part of that value chain, you still learn something. So Taiwan produces lots of silicon chips, and they know how to produce them. And if the more higher valued those are, the harder it is to replace you by another country. China is now having the same dilemma, right? Google stopped licensing its technology to Huawei. So the next generation of Huawei phones that got introduced 2 weeks ago cannot have Google Maps, cannot have any of the Google products. And it's a big, big problem because they were outsourced. They were getting it from Google. Now they'll have to develop the technology themselves. So that may have unintended consequences. My prediction is, unlike what Donald Trump wants, I think, it won't bring the end of Huawei. I think it will allow them to upgrade their know-how further. Similar thing happened with Iran. If you look at Iran manufacturers and manufacturing technology, they have upgraded significantly in the last 30 years because of sanctions on Iran, that they cannot import their technology. They were forced to develop it. But these are countries that had some sort of industrial experience. So there's some. Brazil was doing pretty good in the 90s and 2000s, especially 2000s. But they seem to be going back to the same, this commodity boom-bust cycle also, that Prebisch's nightmare. Developmentalist policies, new and old, it's a big debate. Love to have a discussion just on it, looking at it. We skip one slide here. We came up in the book in chapter 5 with a revised new developmentalist agenda, what it should look like, how it should differ. Environment is one of them. The old developmentalist school book or study book did not refer to anything about the environment, about the limits to growth. We just wanted growth. There's not much paid there. Capacity, absorptive, and both adaptive and absorptive capacities, abilities were completely ignored. Right? The old developmentalist school would say, yes, we need industrial policy. We need to have state enterprises, like in Mexico, like in Turkey, like in Korea. But there was not much attention to, for example, ability to implement them, to have an independent government bureaucracy with an arm-length relationship with the industry, so that if you are protecting certain industries, you are protecting them only temporarily and very selectively. What Turkey and Mexico did, they protected all industries permanently, and there was lots of chronic capitalist relationships going on. South Korea luckily escaped that for a variety of historical and institutional reasons. But South Korean industrial policy was not affected, was not shaped by political interest groups. It differed. And they had a bureaucracy that was capable of doing it. So can we adapt every single policy South Korea did in Uganda? I don't think so. I don't think that is transferable. But it doesn't mean nothing is achievable either. If you look at the success of South Korea, still there are lessons I think that can be learned. So you need a political leadership that is development-minded, that has a long-term vision rather than short-term 4-year, 5-year election cycles. You need to have a government bureaucracy, especially economic bureaucracy, that is not biased by the neoclassical static comparative advantage policies, and it's free from rent-seeking coalitions. The coordination failures between private sector and different industries and the government and private sector, that needs to be overcome by a central planner. But that central planner, the government in this case, needs to be independent, like in Japan, like in South Korea. They were not, and I don't think are independent today in many developing countries. The trade protection should be used very selectively. The same with trade and investment agreements. What kind of agreement you are signing with the US affects your long-run development. If you just open up your trade, there won't be a natural sorting from low skill to high skill. It won't happen. It's not happening. The average productivity rate in Mexico and the rest of Latin America was higher in the 50s and 60s, significantly higher, 3 to 4 times higher than it is today. So we see this downward decline. 80s was the lost decade of Latin America, starting with Mexico. And then 90s became the lost decade of Latin America. 2000s did okay because of the commodity boom. Then 2000, since end of 2008, 2009, again another lost decade for Latin America. Social policies matter and human capital matter, I think. Now, environment, we paid again in chapter 5, we discussed the environmental policies, how much room is there for north-south and south-south exchanges for the environment. Yes, there's more attention to environmental policy in north-south trade agreements and so on than the south-south, but I'm not that optimist or positive about north-south exchanges. I'll give you an example. Last spring, China stopped buying recycled waste from the US. China was the biggest importer of recycling waste from the United States, like plastics and so on, that are not sorted. They would be shipped to China. Most of this was not recyclable, so they would end up in landfills in China. Chinese government said we cannot recycle this. Different plastics are mixed. There are other organic, inorganic wastes. It's not worth, they stopped, they put a ban. So what did the US do? Did they start sorting it out properly and then selling it? No, first they started exporting it to other southern countries. So Turkey became a major importer of waste from the US, which is not recyclable. It goes into landfills. And secondly, they started burning and putting them into landfills in the US itself. The same is true for European Union. European Union may have very strict standards for environment, but as long as they consume as much soybeans and meat from Brazil, they are basically exporting their environmental degradation to other developing countries from their markets. So Germany may look beautiful and pristine, but Brazil is not. So I'm not so sure whether North-South is any better than South-South, and I'm not so sure if we pay attention much to this. The company that is running Fukushima power plant in Japan just announced that they are most likely going to dump the nuclear contaminated water, which is 1 million tons, to the ocean. And that is Japan, that's a northern country. So I think we are facing a collective genocide of the mankind, probably in the next generation. Jared Diamond, famous book, right, The Guns, Germs, and Steel, has a second book called Collapse. Each chapter looks at a human society in the past 2,000 years that collapsed because of environmental factors, because of self-destruction. So as a species, the way we are going, and as economists, we keep ignoring the effect of the environment, I don't think is a good thing. And I'm taking the blame that I did not do a good job either in this book on that part. Islamic finance, I did not work on it. I studied it quite a bit. I find it as a misnomer. I don't think there's anything called Islamic finance. I think it just became popular in the 2000s, mostly partly because of the finance where it was coming from. Just was the thing to write about. And countries like Saudi Arabia and other Islamic-dominated countries were pouring cash into academics to write those papers. In my reading and understanding of it, I don't really see anything different in Islamic finance than non-Islamic finance. I just don't. And if you look at the policies of Islamic finance countries, I don't see them doing anything Islamic the way they define whatever that means. And it differs from one country to the next. So I'm not so sure how much development potential would come from increasing South-South financial flows through Islamic finance. In theory, there are some positive effects like taking partnership in the capital rather than making money out of money. So when a bank loans money, they are taking a partnership in your property, which may have positive effects, but most of the Islamic finance banks also have non-Islamic branches, and money is fungible. So it's very difficult to quantify whether they differ from others. And empirically, I don't see the evidence, at least, let me put it that way. Effects of the super commodity cycle stopped in 2013 because the book went into print in 2015, came out in 2016, so we didn't have the data yet. How much things changed since then? Yes, the commodity prices were already declining. So after 2008, already commodity prices fell and they have not recovered, and I don't see it recovering. European Central Bank just announced they are cutting the interest rates. We are having for 10 years quantitative easing. We have been pumping money into the financial industry for the last 10 years. And things are not better today than 10 years ago, so we need to pump more money into finance. Right there, how do you define stupidity? Repeating the same action twice and expecting a different outcome is the definition of insanity according to some, or stupidity for others. Now, Einstein said two things in finite. One was the universe, and then he added, I'm not so sure, because his model of universe expansion was not conclusive. And he said the second one is stupidity of people. And I think he was right there. So we will pump again, and the US is going to cut probably interest rates next week as well. The amount of money we pumped into financial sector in the US after 2008 crisis, you know the magnitude? How much banks got a loan? They got over $25 trillion. Citibank got $2 trillion alone. And home ownership is below what it was in 1980s today in the US. The unemployment rate is down, but wages are not going up. Wages are stagnating already since 1970s in the United States. The poverty is not going up, going down. And there's a big social dislocation because of this. And there's a big anger building up. And the US elections are coming, general elections next year for the presidential. I am afraid we'll repeat what the outcome of the last election. Because things are supposed to be better. The economy is growing, unemployment rate is at record low levels, but jobs are not any better. And the economy is not doing that much better either. So the commodity prices are not going to recover. That means more dislocation in the south more than in the north. So you may expect more Bolsonaro type politicians in South America. Brazil doesn't look very good right now, right? Europe is not either, if you look at the Brexit. When I travel to Europe and anytime people bring the US politics and President Trump, I say, oh, you know, Europe is not doing much better either. Now Latin America is not. So, but we'll see. I don't know how much things would be different actually now. It may get worse, not better. The cause of divergence on Mexico and Korea, or South Korea and the rest actually, is long. They did follow a decent industrial policy. They were selective, they were temporary. They had an independent economic bureaucracy. It wasn't corrupt as much. They had also certain advantages. The US was there because North Korea, South Korea, right? So US opened its markets unilaterally to South Korea. But then I would say Turkey was bordering Soviet Union as well, right? So the advantages South Korea had, Turkey could have also enjoyed, and it did not. And there are some interesting economists looking at historical factors going back to colonial era. Right? The Iberian colonialism of Latin America was very different than the Japanese colonialism of South Asia or East Asia in general. There's some debate in terms of human cost, there's no debate, but in terms of economic cost and benefits, I think there's something to be picked up there also, how it affected, ruling with proxies versus directly affecting the human capital. At the time of independence, South Korea had better human capital than Latin American countries. They had better independent bureaucracy than Latin American countries. And also, I think they were careful in terms of short run versus long run gain. Toyota did not make a dime of profit for decades. Samsung did not make a dime of profit for decades. The electronics branch of Samsung was only one small-eyed branch of Samsung Corporation. And those affected in terms of long-run changes in those countries. And then there are many others too. Lack of defense spending for South Korea definitely benefited. But then it could have benefited many other countries too. So why don't we have more South Korean miracles? And I think in that case, Ali Sampson, Ray Jenkins, Danny Roderick, and many others do a better job in looking at it. There's a big debate in economics literature what made Southeast Asian tigers different than others. And there's a long list of, I think, things that cannot be replicated, but there are things that can be replicated. So that's the silver lining. Doesn't mean every country can become like South Korea, but there are things you could. One of my students was working on the agricultural industry in Brazil, and he was showing in one data the number of MA and PhD graduates in the agricultural ministry of Brazil, how it changed under President Lula. From almost nothing, it increased like 40, 50 folds. And Brazilian agricultural ministry became one of the leading pioneers in tropical seeds and seed technology. Because the seeds that come from Europe or the US are not suitable for countries that are living around Ecuador, right? Brazil is there, Mexico is close to there too. And they were investing a lot in that technology, and that has a big value, that potential. And Brazil has significant cooperation with sub-Saharan African countries in green technology. It seems to be going back there. They are going back to, again, it's easier and cheaper perhaps to burn the Amazon and raise cattle and soybeans. So I don't know how long that will continue, but there was some hope in some South American countries that could replicate the success of South Korea. In sub-Saharan Africa, there are a few countries that are trying to replicate too in terms of technology transfer. But that remains to be seen how much will come out of it.
Thank you very much. I think it's time for food, so we should stop here. Thank you very much, Firat, for such an interesting talk. And I think, all of us learned a lot today. At least I myself learned a lot. So I think this conference came to a close today, and then we invite you for the conference that will be held tomorrow in this very same room at the same time, right? Is there anything else you would like to mention, Benjamin?
More because in the afternoon is the conversatorio, the conversationalization with Firat will be with the professors,
right?
Development economics, field.
Okay.
Just here. So.
Okay. Well, thank you very much again, Firat, for the talk, and let's go.